How's it going, guys? I'm Brandon from Woodworks. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to go over how I made this crosscut sled. I recently upgraded my table saw to a saw stop. I had a Delta before and I sold that, and I went ahead and gave the guy the crosscut sled for it because it wouldn't fit on here anyway. So I figured I'd show you guys how I did this, and maybe you can make your own. As with all the rest of my sleds and jigs, I started out with a piece of 3/4 inch plywood, and I had them cut it down to manageable size at the store. You can pretty much make it whatever size you want, but for mine I went with 27 inches by 32 inches. Then I slid my fence over to 5 3/4 inches, and I cut two pieces that'll be laminated together later on for the fence on the front, or where your hands go, and then I slid it over to 4 inches and cut one piece for the back. Once I had all my pieces cut for the fences, I could go ahead and laminate the two pieces for the front, just using some wood glue and brad nails. You could leave it like this, but I wanted to add a little bit of character to mine, and I like it to have a little raised portion in the middle. That way it kind of reminds me where to keep my hands away from as the blade's traveling through the fence. So basically I just marked out about an 8-inch portion and put some contours on it just as a guide, and then I took it over to the bandsaw and cut it out. So unfortunately I lost the footage of it, but before I brought it to the bandsaw, I took it back to my table saw and I flushed up both edges. That way there's not an overhang on top or bottom, and it won't affect it when you put it on the sled itself. Once I had it roughed out on bandsaw, I took it over to my sander to kind of do some finish sanding, and I couldn't get all the way in the curve right there, so I actually ended up hand sanding that. You could probably get in there with a spindle sander. I should probably buy one of those. But for now, I'll just make do with what I have. These little sanding sponges are called Micro Zips, I believe, and they get into the small spaces really well. Then I ran a chamfer along the bottom side of the fence on the inside where your workpiece will register to. This allows the space for sawdust to go so it doesn't get stuck between your workpiece and the fence. If it were to get stuck in there, it could potentially throw your cut off square. Once I was done with that, I put an 1/8 inch round over on everything just to kind of smooth out all the corners. Then I took the 4-inch piece I made for the back fence and went ahead and glued that on. This one doesn't have to be perfectly square, it's just basically there for support when you cut the sled in half. It's important to note that when I was adding these brad nails, I made sure to stay away from the direct center where the blade was going to go, so I wasn't going to run through them with my blade. The brad nails were just kind of keep it in place, and then I wanted to add screws for extra support, but again, staying away from the center where the blade was going to go. Then it was time to cut runners that'll run in the miter slots of my table saw. They actually sell these, and I will link those below for you guys that don't want to make your own. But if you do want to make your own, I suggest a nice dense hardwood. I had some hard maple laying around that worked just fine for me. Most saws have the same size miter slots, as mine had 3/4 by 3/8, but yours might be different, so I would go ahead and measure yours just to make sure. I'm sure most of you have seen the gripper by Micro Jig, but I just wanted to feature it here because it's a really good application for it, ripping down really thin pieces of wood. I'll leave a link for it in the description below, as well as all the rest of the tools I use in this video and other stuff you guys might find helpful in the shop. Now it's time to make the reference cut on the sled and cut through the back fence and almost all of the sled, but you want to make sure to leave about 3 inches on the front side because you still have to attach the front fence. Now you can set your front fence on and square it up to the cut line. Once you have it roughly square, then you can go ahead and clamp it down, and then you can kind of fine tune it from there. Once I knew it was perfectly square, I could drive some screws up through the bottom, making sure to pre-drill and countersink the holes. That way the screw heads don't stick out and hit your table saw bed. I did this on the front of the fence as well. I don't know if you guys caught that, and I don't think I mentioned it. So make sure anything that's going to be on the bottom side is countersunk. Then it was time to install the runners. I actually picked up this tip from Matt Cremona to lay some pennies in the miter slot, so that way it holds up your runners off the bottom and ensures a good glue surface to your sled. I cut my runners a little bit shy of the full depth of the miter slot just so it doesn't rub on the bottom and cause too much friction. So how I like to do it is use CA glue on the runners, and then I use the activator spray on the sled itself. I made sure to leave my fence where it was, where I cut the slot before, so it's still lined up. Align it with my fence, lay it down on my runners, make sure everything's even, and then just apply pressure. Then I let it sit for about 10 to 15 minutes. Once it's cured, you can slowly pull it back off, making sure nothing moves or anything. Take it over to your bench, start drilling your pilot holes, and countersink the holes as well. Then I used some 3/4 inch screws and tighten them in by hand, so I made sure not to strip them. I usually use about 5 screws per runner. Once you have everything all installed, you can take it back over to your saw and make sure it glides through the miter slots smoothly. Sometimes it works really well, and sometimes you have to do a little bit of sanding on the rails, that way they slide through the slots nice and smooth. But once you do have it all set up and sliding nicely, you can go ahead and cut through your back rail. I always add paste wax to the bottom of all my sleds and jigs. It makes them slide so much better. And I also apply it to the bed of my table saw, joiner, planer, all that stuff as well. Really easy to apply. You just put a nice thick coat on, paying special attention to the runners. Let it sit for about 10-15 seconds and then kind of buff it all back off. And you can see there how easily it slides with it. I'm just using one finger to push the sled back and forth. At this point, it's pretty much done and ready to use. Crosscut sled is really universal. I usually use it for trimming the ends of cutting boards or pieces that are too big to fit on my miter saw. You can also add a stop block to make efficient repetitive cuts. Well, that pretty much wraps it up. I really appreciate you guys watching. Hope you found the video enjoyable and helpful. If you did like it, please like, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell for when I drop new videos, and leave me a comment below and let me know what you thought of it. Also, I have another video queued up for you over here that I think you'll like as well, and I'll see you guys on the next one.